Hello, everybody. Dumelang, good morning. Bonjour. Sanbonani, goeiemorgen. Welcome to the first installment of the UP Business Breakfast, the Alumni Business Breakfast series. My name is Clement Manyatela. I'm a television and radio broadcaster. I host the midday show on Radio 702. It's called the Clement Manyatela Show. And it's such an honor to be the moderator for our discussion today. It's even more exciting to be among other UP alumni. Don't we have the most amazing community of alumni? Yes. Do you want to clap for that? Yeah. It's just exciting to be here. So thank you so much, guys, for coming through, those who are here physically and those of you who are watching us from various places. So the topic for the first UP Alumni Business Breakfast is Getting the Edge. How South African businesses can survive our failing economy. And we have to be very honest, because it seems to be an economy that is failing, right, for a number of reasons. There are external factors, global factors that are beyond our control, but we also have internal factors. We have our own goals. And businesses are struggling. More so SMEs that are the lifeblood of our economy. In fact, I often argue that the country's best chance at tackling unemployment and even driving meaningful and inclusive economic growth is through SMEs. If you look at businesses today, if they are not trying to recover from the impact of the COVID-19 restrictions, they are faced with the consequences of the war in Ukraine. And then you've got inflation, you've got interest rates that are rising and rising and rising. You have a government sometimes that fails to pay businesses on time for services that have been rendered. I haven't even spoken about load shedding. So a lot of businesses are really struggling to keep their doors open. So how do they survive? And what needs to be done? That's going to be our discussion here today. What is it going to take for our economic reforms? You know, President Cyril Ramaphosa always talks about economic reforms. And one of our panelists here, Busisiwe Mavuso, always is writing opinion pieces about when the reforms are going to be implemented. So what is it going to take for us to see that implementation? And what is it going to take for government as well to start creating an enabling environment that allows businesses to thrive? So we'll be reflecting on the state of our economy, how businesses can survive, but more importantly, what government can do. But before we start our discussion, please help me welcome Professor Louise Whitaker, who is the Deputy Dean here at GIBS, who will be welcoming us.
Thank you very much, Clement, and indeed, welcome everyone this morning to GIBS. Welcome to my fellow UP alumni, as you say, a wonderful community to be part of. I am here to formally welcome you on behalf of our Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Twana Kupe, as well as our Dean, Professor Morris Mtombeni, who is currently in Europe flying the GIBS flag high at an EQUIS accreditation peer review visit. So I'm in their absence, and it really is my pleasure to welcome you this morning. As I'm sure you're familiar with, UP has a very extensive strategy document, as befits a research-intensive and very thoughtful institution. But the crux of that document really is about impact. And you'll see from the brochures that are handed out in your goodie bags that we're serious about impact. And we're serious about impact particularly as it relates to many of the Sustainable Development Goals and issues such as climate, digital transformation. There are articles there that I had a quick squiz, really interesting stuff about malaria prevention and food waste prevention and AI and digital transformation. There's great stuff happening at the university in that regard. Professor Kupe often says that his ambition for UP has been that when the history of Africa in the 21st century is written, there needs to be a chapter about UP and the difference that it made. And I think that's a very powerful vision because it speaks to us and a call to really make a difference. At GIBS, we're part of that. Our mission, which I always have to kind of remember at this point in the right words. But our mission is about improving responsible organizational and individual performance through high-quality business and management education. And this then also raises the question of what do we mean by responsible business and organizational performance? We are also at GIBS aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly goals around climate, digital leadership, and humane leadership. But it's a bigger question, really, I think, for us as we contemplate the role of business in society. Because as a school, we really want to be part of an effective business in a succeeding society and a succeeding economy. For a long time, the idea of responsible business has been about businesses not doing anything that they shouldn't. Primary goal, run your business, don't do anything too naughty outside of that. In the last couple of decades, this has extended to ideas of corporate social responsibility and of businesses actually stepping into the environment in order to make a difference and to do things that are important in that environment. But in the situation that we're faced with in South Africa today, there's an increasing call for businesses to go beyond that and to even begin to make their voices heard in the political and socio-political spaces, increasing calls for that to happen. Is that appropriate? Should we be sticking to our knitting? Or is it incumbent upon us as business people to make a profound difference in an economy which is certainly struggling? And in that context, I think that the content, the subject matter of our first business breakfast here today is just so absolutely crucial. And we have wonderful speakers who are very well positioned to help us think through these challenges, because that's, after all, what we're all about. So Clement is going to introduce the speakers individually, so I'm not going to do that. I'm simply going to say thank you to them for being here this morning on behalf of UP and GIBS, as well as thank you and welcome to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Whittaker. Now, remember, this event is brought to you by UP's Alumni Relations Office, and among our panelists here are GIBS and UP alumni, as I said, including myself, and we also have friends of the university here. So let me introduce the panelists. They were debating who's going to sit next to me, and I think Busi won, because now she's far away from me. Ben Kruger is an independent non-executive director at the Standard Bank Group and Standard Bank South Africa. Ben, thank you for being part of this panel. Busi Mavuso is the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa. Sis Busi, thank you. And Vusi Tembekwayo is the CEO of My Growth Venture Partners. Vusi, thank you for also taking part. Before we dive in, I want to remind you that if you would like to join this conversation online, if you want to tweet about it, just remember to hashtag UP Alumni Business Breakfast when you're posting about it. We would love you to post about it. So please feel free to do that. We're also going to take some time to take questions. We'll start the discussion, but if there's something that comes to your mind, just jot it down. And towards the end, I'm going to dedicate enough time for you guys to engage with the panelists. So let's get straight into it, Ben. Well, you are next to me, so I will start with you. Is it really a failing economy? President Cyril Ramaphosa will probably say, you're really being dramatic by calling it a failing economy. Is it?
Yeah, the definition of a failing economy, I think, is quite broad. And in South Africa, we tend to swing the pendulum very negative, very positive. There's no doubt that we face many, many headwinds. And many of the headwinds we face really is of our own making. We shouldn't have those problems. But where we find ourselves is where we are right now, and we have to move forward from here. And so right now, I would say it's a challenged economy. And if we're not careful, it will be a failing economy in that definition. But there's a lot to be done. And can I make another general comment touching on one of the things that you opened up with? You talk about small businesses, and I think that is so critical. Everyone talks about Southeast Asia and the growth in Southeast Asia. But people don't really focus on, if you think of Germany, for example, in that area around Munich, 18 of the CAC 40 companies, like Siemens and BMW and those companies, are based in Munich. And people often think that that economy is so strong as a result of that. And when you look at that little area there, they have what they call Mittelstand company, which is our smaller businesses. And they have about 7,000 of those. And of the 7,000, 650 of them are number 1 or 2 in the world in what they do. Highly technical, family, small businesses. And so the combination of big business, which is really important catalyst for growth. And if you don't create the right environment for big business to flourish and to invest, it's harder for smaller businesses to be suppliers and operate in that value chain. And I'm sure Vizi will elaborate on this extensively. So I think it is an interesting time. And I don't think it's a failed economy yet, but it's in a danger zone.
Yeah, and Vizi, how do you characterize it? You're always known for being raw when it comes to your analysis of different situations, including the state of our economy. How do you characterize it?
You can say failed.
So it's definitely not a failed economy. It is a failing economy. You know, I spoke to one of the CEOs recently, and he was saying, you know, essentially when you look at it, you will see that our government is already a failed state. The only reason that South Africa is not a failed economy and not a failed state is because we've got a very strong private sector constituency who is very willing to roll up its sleeves and look at how we can make sure that we salvage things, as it were. So I had a conversation with one of the mining CEOs recently, Clement, who just came from investor roadshows from the EU and the US. And he was talking about how it didn't matter whether it was resource fund managers that he was talking to or generals fund managers, the issue of Eskom was always coming up. So there is a serious concern from the global markets in as far as where South Africa is at the moment. He was talking about how it is very scary how South Africa is becoming and can become very insignificant in the global economy. He's worried about the action that the global financial markets are going to take in response to where South Africa is at the moment. He's worried about the loss of confidence by the international community. He's worried about, and I share his sentiments, by the way. He's worried about the minimal new foreign investment that is coming in. He's worried about the fact that because we are failing to get our house in order as a country, the response from the international community is going to be that of, we are moving on. He's worried about the fact that there is a real shift from South Africa to East Africa. And not because East Africa is, of course, they are doing their best in terms of trying to get their house in order, but we are really handing them over our breakfast on a silver platter. As Ben has already said, there's a lot of own goals that we are currently scoring, you know, as a country. The international sentiment at the moment, and I don't know if you saw this article in the Financial Times, it must have been 3 weeks ago, they're talking about the fact that South Africa's doomsday is at 1 minute to midnight. And that, the Financial Times, remember, is a EU publication, or UK publication. The EU is our biggest trading partner, so if that is the sentiment internationally, we should be worried. The sentiment from the business community internally is, and mainly the capital holders, is that capital has a lot of addresses, and that address doesn't have to be South Africa. And if South Africa is not going to be able to get their house in order, then they are definitely moving on. Capital is like water, like water, Clement. It is always going to follow the path of least resistance. So if South Africa is not going to be able to provide a conducive trading environment, Clement, we are failing at the basics, which is network industries. Now, if you can't have energy, transport, and logistics and water in place, out of the 4 network industries, the only one that is functional is telecoms. And it's because that someone had the sense of privatizing telecom back in the day. Otherwise, it would be just as dysfunctional. So I think that is where the business community is. So there is serious, real, growing concerns over where South Africa is at the moment. Ben will tell you that CEOs have to answer very difficult questions from their principals who are not sitting in South Africa. When they have to make investment decisions, remember the BMW, as an example, BMW South Africa CEO, he will tell you that my biggest competitor is not Mercedes-Benz South Africa. It is Mercedes-Benz China. It is Mercedes-Benz US. It is Mercedes-Benz UK, it is Mercedes-Benz Brazil, because when we sit in Germany and we discuss the investment allocation, because the pot of BMW from an investment perspective is very limited, and he has to be able to put a very strong business case against China, Brazil, UK, US to say how much of this investment allocation has to go to South Africa. So at the moment, we are making it very difficult for capital to say what is really the business case for bringing investment into South Africa.
Yeah, sure. Vusi, do we have a tendency to undermine the seriousness of situations? I mean, after the assessment we're getting from Ben and Busi, things are pretty bad. But I read President Cyril Ramaphosa's weekly letters. He sends them every Monday morning. And every time, the suggestion is, things are not that bad. I'm like, are we living in the same country? Like the financial, remember when we were grey-listed? There was literally a newsletter about how it's not that bad.
Exactly.
Sure.
Do we have that tendency to just undermine the seriousness of things?
Well, thanks, Clement. I think that first, if I was in His Excellency's position, I'd probably say the same thing on my newsletter. I don't see a principal of a school telling the parents that the school is poorly run. So I think you have to temper the news from the news teller. Last year, the freight industry, spoke about a loss to our economy in the region of 150 billion rand. And that's just off the back of what's been happening with our rail infrastructure. Now, Sisbosi mentions these network industries. A lot of people, I think, don't understand the importance of network industries. These are the fundamental basics of how you build an economy, right? So in my world, Clement, over the past, I remember when I first started working with Dion and Ben here, in the early days of our firm, we started first as a small company in South Africa. And as we've expanded into the rest of the continent, one of the things I have noticed, there are two major themes. The first is that the average South African doesn't have a sense of the environment we are operating in. The world is not Sandton. And as a consequence to this, we don't understand the importance and the urgency of this moment. Usisposi phrases it correctly, which is this: we are at the pole position on the 100-meter race, but for whatever reason, we seem intent on slowing down. And when we are shackling ourselves and we're wearing heavy, mining boots, and our competitors are very clear that this is a 100-meter race and that they have the work to catch up. Now, all of you here who are in business understand the competitive dynamics of business. You sat in this lecture hall like I did, doing your Porter's 5 Forces. You would have remembered that one of the most effective ways to rapidly build a business is to just copy the winner. So other markets, other economies are looking at South Africa going, okay, so we need a strong and functioning financial economy. I was supposed to be in Rwanda today. I'm not, because I'm here. The government of Rwanda builds the KIFC, the Kigali International Finance Center, who are partners of ours in our firm, I must tell you. And off the back of that says, we want to be the Singapore of Africa. We want to domicile all fintech in Rwanda. Now, they don't have the infrastructure, but they've got the will. We are busy arguing over, whose responsibility is it to make sure that water coming out of your taps is safe to drink. So it's not dissimilar to watching American news and going, what are they talking about? That's how the rest of the continent sees us. They go, what are you guys talking about? They've got real issues. Ben and I shared, just before we started here, I do a lot of business in Nigeria, as does Ben and Sisbosi does too. But you realize when you land at Mohammed Murtala Airport, you can almost taste the fearless hunger. The idea that nobody's coming to save you. There is no income grant from the state. So if I'm to eat today, I must make the meal happen. It's that hunger that got us here, and for whatever reason, we have forgotten it. We are now arguing over things that are just unimportant. So I answer your question in the following way. It's for South Africans to fix. And it's for us, and I have a lot of respect for Sisibusi, precisely because she steps into the fire and calls it out. I must tell you, as I'm sure most of you have, I've seen Sisibusi in interviews where I've gone, "Aye, marai." But it requires that level of courage. Because this moment, when Clement is an important moment for South Africans to wake up and realize we're in a race, we're not guaranteed the win, and everything that we call and think of as our own is for the rest of the world's taking. So every day when we wake up, we must be completely focused and obsessed with the idea of preserving and protecting the gains and building on those gains.
Yeah. When you talk about Sisibusi and how sometimes she's really raw, the problem with, I suppose, the environment in this country is when you come up with solutions and you tell it like it is, you're seen as a rebel.
Yes, sir.
And I'm sure you've seen your own experience in many times when you speak out and you're seen as someone who's against the establishment. And are we running out of ideas, Ben, on how to fix it? And maybe because we'll talk about how we fix it, right? Let's look at the current challenges that are affecting businesses and ultimately our economy. I mentioned that there are global factors, some of which we have no control of, but we've got our own goals. There are certain things we could have done differently that would have helped businesses thrive and consequently see our economy thriving.
Yeah, I think South Africa, unfortunately, is still, after many years, a country in transition. And where we started 30 years ago, people misunderstand how complicated it was, and so it's taking us perhaps longer than what people expect to address that. So we talked about financial capital, and I think that is such a critical thing. Financial capital is like a heart attack. If you don't have it, you don't have it. And when you look at the performance of the JSE and the percentage of foreign investors investing in South Africa, the correlation is startling. When you have foreign investors coming in, the prices are high. If not, they're low. The second thing, which is more like a cancer in our country, is education. As you talk about people every day don't really know what's happening in the country. And one of the other things I do is I serve on the council of University of Pretoria, and it's a remarkable institution. For those of you that haven't seen it, GIBS is rated, again, as number 32 in the world in a Times Media ranking as a business school. And the finance department at TUC now has been ranked as a business school as well, the only one in the country that got that. But the fascinating thing is if you look at the total rankings, in the Times Media, which is a smaller component, TUC's ranked 69, and now in the new QS holdings, out of 40,000, they rank at 323 this year. And why do I say that? You say at the one end you have institutions like the universities like this, and so what we do now is we take kids from all the schools. And if you come from a private school in South Africa or a level 5 school, you have no difficulty getting into university anywhere in the world. If you come from a level 1 or 3 school in South Africa, it is very difficult for those kids. We have programs now that turn a 3-year degree into a 4-year degree, and some of them go on a 5-year degree to get a BCom.
Sure.
And the only reason is that the base foundation of education is actually so defunct. If you have that in a country for people arriving at university that have finished school, you think how many people have no concept of that, And so I think in terms of adult literacy and how we deal with all of these things, the human capital, that capital has actually been left behind in our country. And that's a difficult thing to fix. If you look at Nigeria spent a lot of money on educating people. Kenya, the same thing. The education system. Zimbabwe still. You find some of the best qualified people coming out of Zimbabwe. So the education systems are really highly regarded and really very important. And that makes a huge difference to society and to society in general. Buzi will talk about all the complicated things in the network, and that is really so important. But I think for us, we have to be able to marry the long and the short. I arrived in Nigeria once, and the former governor of the central bank invited me for lunch, and he said he's just come from South Africa, and he looked at the infrastructure that we have, and if you landed at that airport 10 years ago, it was a nightmare. It was really a nightmare. And he said, we are so lucky in South Africa. And I said to him, but when I go to Nigeria, I find the same thing. People are so energized and so driven for that last and he was serving us chicken, and the chicken leg was this long. It was a very skinny leg with a small bit of meat, and he said to me, Nigeria is like this chicken leg. If you look at this, even to catch a chicken, you have to run fast. To stay alive as a chicken, you have to run even faster. And that is so true. I think our competitive focus is on the wrong things in many parts of the country. And there's a divisiveness. I think Buzi plays an enormous role in trying to put pressure on people to think about the things that are really important, because we tend to be so emotional about the things that we collectively need to do that we don't want to tackle that. It's in the space that people don't talk about, and people don't say, this is an issue. And I salute her for what she does. I think it's a really important thing to raise these things and to bring it to the table in a way that everyone can relate to. And it's the same for all of us. If it's good for one company, it will be good for everyone else. And that's the way we grow. That's the way we create jobs. And that's the way we finally create a more normal society.
Yeah. You mentioned, Sis Busi, that you've spoken to some CEOs in the mining sector. And I'm interested to find out if there are specific industries that have been resilient and have been thriving in this current economic climax, and are there lessons we can take from those businesses? What makes them successful in this current climate?
I think the entire business community at the moment, and I think more so SMMEs, and Vusi, I'm sure, will definitely touch on that, there is a certain degree of resilience and somehow finding a way of getting on, in spite of the serious challenging environment that we are facing somehow. But you also have a lot of pockets of excellence that you're actually sitting with as a country that we have, and I think the financial services sector is definitely one of those, So it's interesting, Clement, because it therefore tells you that if South Africa were to, and if government in particular, were to probably maybe look at this notion of partnerships more carefully and look at how we can co-create the solutions for the problems that we have, we really wouldn't be sitting here. A lot of the problems that we have at the moment, if you just take Transnet, you would have seen how the mining industry kept on talking about, we'd like to get involved to try and find solutions for Transnet. The third-party access, that we've been talking about, trying to bring in the private sector into generation. It's happening now, but you look at it and you're saying, do we really need to have all the 743 SOEs if all of them are failing? Are they all strategic? Are there areas where the private sector should really be playing because they are doing a damn good job of it? It doesn't make sense that government insists on monopolies when clearly you don't have the know-how, the expertise, the resources to can actually turn these institutions around as it were. So I think from a sector perspective, I think you probably maybe find your tourism and stuff that are struggling, but I think a whole lot of other economies are as difficult as it is, but somehow they are getting by, Vusi. SMMEs are actually, finding a way of how to actually overcome our problems, and what interventions do we put in place to see how we somehow move on. So when we speak about South Africa being a very resilient economy, I think it's the resilience of sectors, it's the resilience of entrepreneurs, it's the resilience of small businesses in terms of somehow finding solutions and bypassing, the useless government that we have.
Yeah, and right, told you. How have businesses been able to adapt, Avusi? Because I imagine in this tough environment where the odds are against you, you need to think out of the box, you need to somehow adapt your business model and so that you remain competitively and financially stable and viable as a company in this failing economy. How do you think businesses have been able to to carry on and be resilient and push on when almost everything is against them?
So maybe let me just flex a little bit and give you a sense of what what we're seeing, right? So we operate in the growth space, and most people don't understand the way private capital works. So at a very high level, there's early stage capital, there's very mature capital, and then there's the growth stage in the middle. Now, in South Africa, typically you'll hear a conversation about, we need to build these entrepreneurs. And so let's have a workshop somewhere and let people come in with business plans. The literature tells us that that doesn't build entrepreneurs. The entrepreneur isn't at the workshop, and he's definitely not writing the business plan. He's not. On the other end of that, you have these like very mature industries run by incredibly gifted, talented operators, typically, as Ben said, in private, very family-owned businesses. But they've professionalized. They're second, third, fourth generation. You find here a lot of the Asian community in particular operating those businesses. Go to Beggarsford today. The back end of that entire economy is almost the Indian community that runs almost all of the industries, right? The place I come from, Benoni. Without Actonville, there's no Benoni, because that's where the trade is, right? And then in the middle is the entrepreneur and the business owner who's a 10-man band trying to become a 100-man band. That's the space we play in. Let me tell you what we're seeing. First, insofar as we're talking about the provision of capital in this country, that's a major problem. Because those businesses don't yet have the profile to attract massive institutional capital. They just wouldn't get the meeting. But they also don't have the PR flavor to attract the early stage money. So a lot of those businesses are self-capitalized. It's a partnership of 3-4 people who double dip into their bond to fund the short-term working capital issues as they look to scale those businesses. The second problem there, I have been saying this for 15 years, and I don't know why it is about us as South Africans. We have the conversation and then we don't do anything. How many more times must the conversation be had about labor law reform? When I start a business and I employ one person, the regime of labor laws that applies to me is the same regime of labor laws that applies to ShopRite. How are you expecting an entrepreneur to build a business if you must first have a meeting and then a caucus and then a disciplinary? And look, you had the job to do, you're fired. It's very simple, this thing, right? Now, it seems a simple example, but it's our inability to unlock those quick wins. So today, many of you here in this room probably know what I'm about to say is true. You might not admit it publicly. But the risk to return of staying in corporate as a capable, talented, qualified individual is an order of magnitude the risk and return of getting into private enterprise and starting a business. This means the following, which is my final point. Here's what we're seeing. If I am in East Africa, broad statement, highly colored, but allow me to give a 40,000 feet view. If I'm in East Africa, North Africa, West Africa, and I run into an entrepreneur, he's an entrepreneur by design. That's what he wants to do. That's what he or she has decided to do. In South Africa, if I run into an entrepreneur, it's by default. It's because there was nothing else to do. So you have great talent dispersed in large organizations where the alpha for their performance is less experienced in the economy than if that great talent were to start businesses. And that, for me, is precisely where the issue needs to take place. It's just, let's get the simple things right.
Where do we start, Ben?
I actually think that is such a crucial point because the provision and the allocation of capital in the country is a problem. If you think of one of our strongest industries is the retirement savings industry. And we have some of the strongest fund managers in the country. They compare globally. But if you look back over 30 years, we've seen a massive amalgamation and concentration of funds under management and fewer fund managers. Similarly, if you look at the stock exchange has been number 17, 18, 19 in the world for 2 decades now. But we have less than half the companies listed 20 years ago. And admittedly, many of the companies that were listed were individual mines and so forth, which also provided entrepreneurs and small mining ventures. Now it's consolidated into large mining houses, a lot of concentrated, large, very efficient companies on the stock exchange. So you have the wealth company investing in fewer shares, and you have the large companies buying smaller companies. And so the really important growth part of the economy is actually at the lack of capital from the formal sector at the top end. And you can see that the JSE's now got a private placements place. There's a lot more private capital going into this. One positive thing that I've seen in the last year is exactly this in the middle growth bit and the continuity between debt and equity. And for many people, they don't understand that. And banks, I think, traditionally were really, really poor at this. In the investment banks, they're very good at understanding that. But in the commercial banks, they don't really. You know, they would give people a loan, and in fact, they're giving them equity. And then things go wrong, and they didn't understand that they were actually providing equity. And so now they're getting better. And so in the last round of financial reports, all the banks had grown in this sector by about 50%, which is the fastest growing banking sector in South Africa, small businesses, commercial businesses. And that's a really positive signal. And I think if you get to allocating the right capital into the sector and make it easier for people to do that, that's really important. The point about entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs are iterative. They learn on the run, you know, and if you can't make a mistake, you're never going to be an entrepreneur. It's just some people have such a fear of failure that they actually stop doing something because they're so scared of getting it wrong. And so if you can fail quickly and iterate and work out why did you fail and how do you do differently, you find that entrepreneurs have an ability to actually replicate what they do in different industries, in different territories and so forth. And I think the more we grow into that, the more we will have a natural evolution of this. But that obviously is on a premise that Busi's done her work and the government is functioning well.
Yeah. Vusi spoke about labor law reforms. Ben talks about the issue of capital, which Vusi also touched on. What else, says Vusi, do you think government can do? Quick wins that Vusi speaks about. What can we do? I mentioned earlier that the president has always spoken about economic reforms. I've read many of the articles. I've even had conversations with you about the lack of implementation of those reforms. What is it that government can do now to support businesses, but to ensure this inclusive economic growth?
You know, everything that we've spoken about in terms of what is failing in this country and what needs to be fixed is really a function of we are not getting it right from the top. Clement, you just need to put the right people in power. Everything else will fall into place. Sure. And I think that is a serious fundamental weakness and gap that we have, you know, in the country. If you are going to have a city of Joburg mayor who has got a grade 10, what do you think is going to happen in the city of Joburg? What strategic thinking, direction is going to happen in as far as that is concerned? Sure. If you have cadre deployment, if you have CFOs who don't understand the difference between income and cash in municipalities, why are you surprised that you've got failing and dysfunctional municipalities? So from where I sit, everything rises and falls on the strength of leadership. You know, it's garbage in, garbage out. There is absolutely no way you're going to expect that city of Joburg mayor to be able to do wonderful, innovative things, you know, when he doesn't, it's unfortunate because you're putting him in a position where he is destined to fail. Yeah. You know, he has lost the race before he has even begun running, you know, and I think, so honestly, we can talk about a whole lot of things which are not working in the country at the moment, but I think really, you know, you just need to, the system, I think at some point we would realize as a country that the fundamental mistake that we made in this country was this system of cadre deployment, you know, of sure. Pushing out the people who knew what they were doing, you know, in the public service. You know, the skills, the expertise, the experience, you know, they were pushed out on whatever premise, and you have brought in this lot, you know, even when you've got the most brilliant of plans, you know, because it's not a function of we need to find out, or we need to come up with solutions. Solutions are there.
yeah.
You just have people who are failing to implement, because honestly, they are put in positions where even if when they want to do what is right, and to implement, they just cannot, because they don't have the tools, the know-how, the expertise, the capacity, the capability to can do it. So I think it's really a function of leadership.
Ngiyaxolisa, Clement, if you'll allow me to just maybe just tag team with Usisibusi on this. The point Usisibusi made is so fundamental and important. And I just want to double click into my space. So most entrepreneurs complain about there's no provision of capital. You want to start a business, where do I get money? Global problem, by the way. Even when the central reserves are printing money, there's still no money. I've seldom heard entrepreneurs who say to me, or who understand that in South Africa you've got, at a provincial level, provincial institutions with the mandate to provide capital for entrepreneurs. Every single province in this country has an institution given capital by Treasury whose sole job it is to find entrepreneurs and give them money. And almost none of them meet their quotas. You ask them, they say they are no entrepreneurs. If I went on social media today, I'd get 1,000. So lento sisibusi ayikhulumayo where Clement, that there's a serious capacity issue. And I think when sisibusi, in part the problem is that we have been, perhaps as a country, too obsessed with what our politics look like and the substance of what our politics delivers. And so if I'm able to round my R's, I get further down the pike, than if I speak Vusi Thembekwayo's private school English. And as a consequence of this, you've got incredibly capable, talented people who look at what the complexion of our political system and public sector looks like and can't identify themselves as adding value to that. And it's dissimilar to going to the circus, knowing it can be performed better, but not seeing yourself as the clown in the show. But all of us are going, this clown is terrible. And last point. If you think about it, we are almost bipolar as a country. We're either incredibly sophisticated, institutions that Uncle Ben and Usisibusi, incredibly sophisticated, top of the world stuff, or we're proper underdeveloped. And there's nothing in the middle. And it's our inability to step into the breach and to build that middle. That's what creates the fervor and the flavor and the development and the growth. This is why our inner cities are overrun. Inner cities all over the world inner cities are the bedrock of the middle. You go to London in High Street, that's the middle. You don't see large industries. You go to Canary Wharf for large industries. But if you want to see the middle of the economy of the United Kingdom, then you go to High Street, you'll see it, right? And it's our inability to go, what does the city of Tshwane look like? That corner, when I turn right on 3rd and whatever, what shop is there? That tells you what is the economic activity of the day, every day, that people are engaged in, right? And Usisibusi, I just wanted to make the point that she is so right, that lack of capacity is not at the planning level. It really is at so when we get to work on Monday, what are we going to do? And then a final point, also the recognition that government is complex. South Africa has this concurrent system of government. So if our president is in a small town somewhere and his blue light brigade hits a pothole, he can't fix the pothole. Legally, he doesn't have the powers to fix the pothole. This is why he went to court and said, I can't fix ESCOM. I don't have the powers, right? And we carried that as him saying, I'm abdicating myself of the responsibility. What he was saying is, I constitutionally don't have the powers to intervene. Now, the question we must ask ourselves is, if you are a fast-growing, rapidly accelerating company in a hugely innovation-led environment where your competitors are adapting quickly, do you want the CEO, the executive management team, and the operational management team run on a different level of government and they report only to themselves? No. You want a system where there is accountability. And so in this concurrent system of government, then add that cadre deployment, 4,000 people meeting at a conference to decide our collective fate, you're sitting with a ticking time bomb.
Yeah. They've been talking about professionalizing the public service and streamlining it for so many years now. Let's pick Vusi and then I'll come to Ben. Let's talk to the businesses now. People who are listening to us who say, I run a business and I'm struggling. I hear what you guys are talking about. That's how I feel every day. But how do I survive? When you go to Ditsobotla municipality, there's a clover that said, we're leaving. Yeah. The roads are terrible. There's no access to water. It's impossible to run a business in this municipality. And you've got a lot of business people out there who are committed to continuing to keep their employees, who are committed to continuing to improve the economy and conditions in the country, but they're struggling. So what do they do?
I feel a bit of a fraud to answer your question, Clement, because even in our firm, we've had to make, so today we have a distributed workforce, completely globalized. We have people in the Philippines and Pakistan, in the Middle East, in the US, and here, and then in other parts of the continent. Because we recognize that if we're going to compete in the global environment, we need a certain nuance of talent and skill and expertise. And you go to the place where the talent, skill, and expertise can give you the productivity you want at the lowest unit of labor, unit cost of labor. It's a simple thing. It's called an income statement. Reduce my costs. The levels of productivity I see from our team in the Philippines, as a consequence of it, probably halved our administration team in SA. Just productivity, nothing else. This is what I mean when I say we think we are competing in little boxes. We're not. We are this thing called the WWW, this HTTPS invention of the internet, made the world flat. And so today, I know there's an entrepreneur who's in our accelerator program. He's in the manufacturing space. He completely outsourced his manufacture and shut down the factory in Kokstad. Kokstad, small little town. He shut down the factory, 50 people out of work. He's making 3x the bottom line, kept the top line the same, and that's all just because of the savings. And then the reduced issues of no labor law, no shop steward coming to scream at him because he's promising things that can't be delivered, right? So I feel a fraud answering your question only to say one of the humilities God has taught me over the years, and it's only by God's grace I've learned this, it is that one can't speak of the other person's consequence unless you are in it. There's an entrepreneur today who doesn't know how they're going to pay their phone bill or water bill, who's 4 or 5 cycles behind in terms of submitting their VAT returns because they don't have the cash flow. They want to collect the cash from customers, but the customers can't pay them, and they're afraid that if they put the customers in administration, they will lose the business forever. At the same time, they've got school fees bills, medical aid bills, bank bills, debit orders, the house is 3-4 months into default. This is the reality of what we are seeing every day. And then they go to the Eastern Cape Development Corporation, whose mandate it is to assist. And they're given an analyst who's never run a business. They're taken to an office where they have to sit and wait 2-3 hours for somebody to see them. They're given an 80-page business plan template asking them to do a SWOT. Chief, I sell carbs. Strength, carb. Weakness, carb. and this is, so it's in our inability to just go, what is the solution for this specific problem and how do we address it? Usis Busi mentioned it. I will end with this comment. It is ultimately because there is nobody to be held accountable. That's why we are where we are.
Yeah.
And so the consistent degradation, who do we hold accountable for the past 10 years? No one. Life just moves on. And people occupied seats, some delivered, some did not. And they just move on. And as you would know, in your place of employment, Clement, and you as an employer in your household where you have a helper, there's accountability. If you come home and the helper has, mistakenly broken a glass, we're having a conversation about this expensive champagne glass you just broke. There is accountability in all spheres of life. If you eat bad food, you're going to get fat. So even God designed accountability. South Africans just like, no, it's fine. Right? So to Sis Busi's point, the city of Joburg will experience whatever it experiences. And at the end of the movie, when the credits are read, the story will be poor spending, unqualified audits, but there will be nobody, no person to be held accountable. And until we do that, it's going to be very difficult for us to drive ourselves out of this malaise.
Wow.
How do we hold them accountable, both to you, Ben, and Sis Busi? Because you mentioned Hammanskraal and the issue of water. Where's the accountability there? If anything, they are pointing fingers at each other. Even with ESCOM, they tell you about solution, but no one seems to be wanting to take accountability. And I'm interested in the role business can play, Ben, because often business engages with the president, and I believe they can play a meaningful role as part of the stakeholders in holding government and our leaders accountable and pushing for these reforms. So how do we ensure that accountability?
You want to go first?
Accountability in government, I don't know how many times, and I think we have alluded to it, Clement, we've spoken about somehow having KPIs for these ministers. I don't even know whether they exist. If they exist,
Sure.
they clearly are just documents lying there and we never interact with them because nothing ever happens. So if you're talking about someone holding government and ministers accountable, then it's definitely not Cyril Ramaphosa. He doesn't have that bone in his body. He can't do it. So you therefore hold government accountable by chucking them out. There is absolutely no way that this government, if we are pinning our hopes as a country on this government to think that there's going to be change and, economic trajectory in a different direction and delivery on this current government, you are wasting your time. So, someone once said, the duration of oppression is always determined by the oppressed, not by the oppressor. The oppressor at the moment is this ANC-led government. We are the oppressed. So at some point, we're going to have to say enough is enough. We are no longer going to be subjected to this, I don't even know what to call it. So when the electorate is angry enough to chuck these people out and understand that there is a system of meritocracy. It's not about how loudly I speak, as I always do, and how gesturous I am that I'm fit to hold office. It's about what do I plan to deliver, and do I have the capability to deliver it? And those are the people that you actually have to put in power. Someone once said, it's amazing how leadership and governance always seem like over-exaggerated concepts until they are no longer there. Because while they are still there, this thing seems to run on autopilot. 1994 to 2009, we were there. We did so much. We came from being a junk status economy. We achieved it. We were on the right trajectory. And what is the one thing that we messed with in 2009? It was the leadership. When all of a sudden this thing came crumbling and it's still going in that direction. So how we hold them accountable, put the right people in power. It's not up to government, it's up to the electorate. You need to elect the right people.
What is he saying to you guys? Cyril Ramaphosa, that is. You as business leadership South Africa, in fact, I think as early as 3 weeks ago, there was a meeting with him. You often engage with him. When you say these things to him, what does he say? Does he recognize the seriousness of the crisis? Because also they don't want to call it a crisis.
The problem with engaging someone like the president is that he believes that consensus is the only way that you get things done, and that is the only, I don't know, leadership model that you pursue to make sure that you achieve what you want to achieve. So there's nothing wrong with consensus. I think that is absolutely brilliant. But when you have tried consensus for I don't know how long has been in power, and it has dismally failed, leadership says to me, you therefore have to probably maybe adjust your model and look at how differently you look at this. Because see, the problem with consensus is that everyone agrees because it is some form of middle ground, but none of us are really committed to it. You know, it's middle ground, we can all live with it, but there is no serious conviction to say we believe in this thing, definitely we're going to. So I think that is the problem with these compromise positions. So what does Cyril say? He says what he always says. You know, we are happy to work with you, whatever the case is. Do I buy what he's selling? I don't, far from it. Why is business still working with him? Because we can't wish him away. This is the only government we have. Therefore, if we could, we would, you know. So we have an obligation. Disengaging from business is not an option. And these are the conversations Ben would know we always have in boardrooms. You know, we get very frustrated. We walked away from the social compact discussions last year, but we had to come back to the drawing table and say, but if we disengage, then what? We have an obligation to somehow roll up our sleeves and see how this works. And we have an opportunity now again, you know, to intervene on energy, transport and logistics and crime and corruption. Let's see if government will give us the space to be able to do that. We have said the 4 West performing power stations in Eskom, give those 4 to us. And we are going to run them and see if we can change them around. Let's see that when we put our engineers on the ground and we get there, they will actually allow us the space.
Oh, good luck trying to convince Gwede Mantashe about that. And Ben, that's the problem, right? Is sometimes the president may have good intentions, but consulting, there's also that political negotiation of what does the SACP think about the concept of privatization? What will they think if we start allowing Transnet to have private equity partners? And when you start doing that, Ben, I mean, you're not going to get anywhere, because ideologically, there are some alliance partners of the ANC that are against the reforms that you want to implement, which is why we start seeing the president in the presidency going to the private sector and getting people to come be a red tape cutter, someone to come and drive the red tape cutter, issues around visas. When you've got Home Affairs, when you've got departments whose responsibility is to do that.
Look, we can talk for the whole morning about what's wrong in government. And I think Cyril is not ill-intended. He's well-intended, but ill-directed. You know? And that's the difference. And if you have consensus without urgency and reflection and proper debate, you end up with the lowest common denominator, which is a terrible place to end up. I want to hook up with some of the comments that my panel's made. You know, the world is changing. All the economies globally are changing, so is ours. You know, so 20 years ago, we were the best manufacturing country on the continent, and we were globally competitive. 20 years ago, electricity prices were some of the lowest in the world, et cetera, et cetera. We built aluminium smelters here to export electricity. You know, we have no raw material for aluminium, so the products are imported. They smelt it here because we had such cheap electricity and then exported. And now we end up with not enough electricity to run a small business. And so when you listen to Vizier on his own business, you get a sense that he's understood that the services economy has become very big in South Africa. Mining has changed. Gold mining is small. Platinum is still running around. A massive change around that. Vizier touched on tourism. It's now one of the biggest providers of jobs in the country and a lot of foreign currency. Then you get to the manufacturing businesses that have closed. We had a small company. When we were small, they made all the bicycles we rode on. They then started importing product from China. They had 3 factories in South Africa. And then the Chinese send them these kits. They closed 2 factories and they assembled the Chinese kit at half the cost of what it cost them to make a bike. Then the Chinese came out when they saw a lot of volume and said, well, we can do better. We can ship you the entire assembled bike. And they gave them a price which was 50% of the cost of the assembled units, which was then 25% of the cost of what they could make a bike. And so guess what? They closed the final factories, all the people lost their jobs, and now they're actually a distributorship in the country. And so in so many little towns and cities across the country, you'll have exactly that example. And so if you in government, you're elected. And so therefore you worry about that. If you're in private sector, you're not elected. You're not there to please the electorate. You're there to actually get a job done. You need to create an environment where people want to work, where people want to buy your products, where you can create growth, where you've got a strategy that's sustainable. That's what you get paid for. If you don't, you get fired. So, but being elected, you're so concerned about, am I going to be in power? And that's a big problem. And to me, that is actually not, you can't really marry that with the delivery required that Vusi highlights here in the thing. So if you look at the Department of Trade and Industry, I've looked at some examples between Kenya and ourselves. We had a large group of investors who came in, the CEO of Alibaba came amongst them. And they were looking to invest here. And we had a massive roadshow. Many companies dealt with them. Then we got to the government interaction. So the minister was coming to speak at the breakfast. There were about 120 foreign investors. And the night before he called and said, no, he actually can't make it. He'll send the Director General. In the morning, 10 minutes before the presentation, the Director General called and said, he can't make it, he's sending his deputy. And so his deputy came in. He had not been prepared. The poor guy arrived. You see, there's 120 people there. And the only presentation he had was on black economic empowerment. And so he spoke to foreign investors for 45 minutes on black economic empowerment. The second stage of the roadshow goes to Kenya. So the Minister of Trade and Industry hosts a lunch for them, and he talks to them about the Kenya 25-year plan and what they want to do. And so they had a fantastic afternoon. And then before he closes the afternoon session, he makes this announcement. He said he's spoken to the president and explained to him that he was quite surprised at what he's found here, and the president would like to host everyone for a dinner at the palace that night. So changed the plan completely. Now, we've lost the head office for John Deere, we've lost the head office for IBM to Kenya. So the point of East Africa, this is happening around us. Now, when you look at the government, any business needs a plan, how you bring these things together. We don't have that in government. We don't understand in the new economy, what do we do? And I think the services sector is driven by itself. Telecoms, financial services, those things have grown. The Reserve Bank is very good, I think, as an institution. And then you have a lot of pockets of real excellence. But on the manufacturing side, it's a divisive process. You try and bring in red tape, you make it as difficult on every single thing that you can do. And the point that you listen when you do things in Manila and Philippines, because that's the cheapest, And so the real test for us, if you want to be a manufacturing country, how do you line up the resources to make it the cheapest? The most bizarre thing, you look at the cost that this brings. The Aspen plant in Port Elizabeth that manufactured the vaccines, and it's a world-class plant. They now have to have their own water. They have to build a water filtration system that you cannot imagine how much it costs. They now run 60% on solar. They're building a hydrogen plant. In a year, they'll be off the grid. And so a plant like that has to be off the grid for water and electricity. The government actually has invested in a similar facility in Cape Town called Biovac. And so then Biovac goes to a tender, and then the government gives the tender to someone in India. And if you actually look at the farmer background, there is no reason for that to have happened. So the government owns half the facility, but they still do that. So this disconnection in government is a terrible thing. There's no business that would operate in such a disjointed manner and survive. If you can't pull all the areas together and work as one unit, you've got no chance. And I think in government, there is no, I can't see who's the orchestrator. That the president is not that, and I can't see who's doing that. Everyone is so focused. They take everything that they've received when they came into the job, and the good ones try and think if they can make it a little better. The other ones don't even think of that. They try and understand what they should be doing. And so unless you have someone that can look at these things strategically and say, what am I trying to achieve doing this job, and how do I react to doing that? I think it's going to be very, very hard. And to me, I agree, it's leadership. You got to have very different leadership. You got to have very different ways of testing them. And you got to separate the people that are in politics that need to be elected and people that run state-owned enterprises that should do it not because they're elected. If they're elected, you've got a problem. They need to be there because they can do the job. They're measured on how they do the job. And it should be brutal if they don't.
Yeah, they still have to pass through the cadre deployment policy, right? Are they a comrade tick or not? Are they going to help us get some tenders, tick or not. We're going to get some questions now. So please, can you, if you are here in the venue, you can raise your hand if you've got a question for any of the panelists. If you are watching us online, you're also welcome to participate. There are already a number of questions that are coming through online. So please, I asked you earlier, jot down something if you want to weigh in, or maybe you just want to give an input. Are you guys happy for me to go to the questions? All right, so I will start with some questions online. And if you are here, please use your mics. You can just raise your hand. If you are a CADA, I will note you and prioritize you. But we'll start with messages online. And there's one for you here, Sis Busi. It says, Ms. Mavuso lists the financial sector as the ones that is thriving this season. And I would say it's expected. Businesses are struggling, so it could be that their only recourse is to seek financing from banks and the like. Is there any sector that is really, truly thriving apart from the financial services?
You know, Clement, I think maybe let's look at this post-COVID, because I think COVID was a serious issue and test for all of businesses, all sectors. So maybe you probably have to look and say, is there an industrial sector that doesn't exist post-COVID? And I think that speaks to the resilience, you know, I think of the South African businesses, and irrespective of which sector they're in. Tourism suffered, but I think they've somehow bounced back, you know. So I think thriving, you know, I don't know, because I think when you even speak about retail, they will tell you that, I don't know if any of us can say we are actually thriving. Probably maybe those maybe in the ICT space, and but when you look at retailers, for instance, because one of the things that has made things worse from a trading environment for businesses is that we now have to provide services that government would ordinarily have to provide. So even if when we have an opportunity to be thriving and to be doing better, but now you're spending 60 million rands per month on diesel. Now you actually have to put up, I don't know, Jojo tanks, because when you open the taps at Babelegi municipality, the water that is coming out is green. You know, you now have to actually bypass the Durban ports to make sure that your consignment lands in Mozambique, because the Durban port is dysfunctional and you can't even put your goods on rail. You actually have to put them on the road and hope that they actually reach its final destination, because otherwise the N3 is going to barricade that truck and they are going to steal your consignment or kill your driver because they are saying he's xenophobic, and or rather he's Zimbabwean and he's stealing their women and their job. Whatever it is that they kill these people.
Sure.
That's what they say, right? They're stealing our jobs and whatever. You know, and you actually have to put in or contribute to a fund that Discovery and them have put in place to fix potholes or what. So it's very difficult, you know, to talk about thriving, you know, in this environment. We are doing what we need to do. I think there are reasonable returns that we're getting. But if the trading environment was to be better, you know, I think we'd actually be doing so much more. Ben, I don't know, is there an industry that has been decimated post-COVID? You know,
COVID, first you had COVID, and then following COVID, you had the war in Ukraine, and then you have high inflation and all the volatility, you know. So it's a perfect storm for anyone in business today. This is worse than a financial crisis of 2008, and it's a very, very difficult time. And even financial services institutions, if you look at them, they're doing better because interest rates are higher. But their bad debt rates are up maybe 70% by the end of this year, you know.
Sure.
And so there'll be, I think the big banks each will be writing off 15 billion this year in bad debts. You know, so these are massive costs and numbers to run through the system. I think the solar industry is doing very well. I mean, we see so many solar businesses.
That's an industry that...
But it is pockets. And there are really good entrepreneurs that are really focused on how to align these strategies. But it's not a time that's easy to thrive. You don't have a tailwind. You know, you're facing so many headwinds and globally, which manifest locally into these things. And so I think it's a very tough time in general for every business.
And Vusi, the tough thing is businesses now have to think, how do I manage my costs and optimize my resources? I mean, if I'm spending so much money now on diesel, if I'm spending money to put up infrastructure so that I can good access to water, if I'm spending money hiring additional security because crime,
Yeah.
how do you then offset the costs so that you don't pass that through to your client, your customer? It's such a tricky, delicate balancing act.
In an economy where the unemployment rate is increasing, but in real measures, not these numbers that get, in real measures, unemployment is increasing, inequality is increasing, poverty levels are getting more pronounced, and as a consequence of this, the everyday lived experience of your average customer is that they're feeling the pinch. So not only are you asking the question, how do I pass on the cost, but you're asking the question, to whom? Because who can afford it, right? All of these are, I do think that, and maybe in our arsenal, when I say it's one of those things that requires, like if I'm used to myself, I often wonder if, like at a cabinet meeting, they take one day to just do like an innovation workshop, I don't know, some design thinking.
No.
And the fact that we're laughing just speaks to it, right? Like because you would do it in every other enterprise. You would do it in every other enterprise. You would take the time to divorce your mind from the reality you're in, and you would craft the time to imagine the future you want. And then you'd say, so how do we get there, right? Because if we were to do that, then one of the things you begin to realize is, with our exchange rate the way that it is, it means that for global enterprise to look at South Africa, the cost of doing business from South Africa becomes cheaper. And so maybe then we change our conversation and our positioning. Rather than how do I do business in South Africa, it becomes how do I do business from South Africa. If I'm a global enterprise and I'm seeing what's happening with the ZAR to the USD, and I'm thinking about ZAR as access to the rest of the other markets around SADC, then all of a sudden, my investment decision, right, is different. I don't even know that we're positioning this conversation. Last I checked, our tourism authorities were trying to back an English Premier League team. This is the idea around how do we drive tourism. So we're not having these design thinking conversations. It sounds silly when you say it, but the fact that we're not doing it, it's precisely what is the consequence to the problem. Most of you here in this room will know, if you've traveled to Liechtenstein, go to Riyadh, I mean, just go to Israel and leave the politics alone and just go and ask the question, what are they doing? What are they doing? I'm based in the Middle East, and it's crazy, Sisbusi, to see people who took a desert and built a city. It was a desert. And they went, we're going to turn this into the Mecca of the world. With nothing other than the simple sheer force of will. And they're doing it. Uncle Ben will know, because he's in financial services, that when the 08 crisis happened, it wiped them out. They're back. Double-digit growth rates, and they're pulling capital. And you know this is true because all of you here in this room must know at least one South African who's done either the semigration or the emigration. Wow. The lesson we learn, and it's what Sisbusi mentioned earlier, capital has a supremely monogamous relationship with return. Capital will never cheat on return. Capital doesn't go to ideology conferences. It doesn't know who Karl Marx is. Capital goes, I put $1 in, how much do I get out? Yep. You can go to your conferences and argue and write position papers and Leninist, Marxist. Listen, Chief, payroll. What's the date today, entrepreneurs? We're 3 days away from payroll. So when you see a politician get asked these questions, both in both the governing and the opposing parties, and the answer is ideological, that's the problem. Is that you have people who studied 18th, 19th century ideological thinking and think in the contemporary world of artificial intelligence and the flattening of the world today, some Leninist, Marxist theory is going to answer the questions of our lived realities. It's until we understand those pressures, I think, that we're going to continue to struggle around these issues.
Yeah. We have a quick.
That deserves a hallelujah.
Hallelujah. Do we have a question? We've got one over here. One, two, three, four, five, six. Okay. Can I start over here?
Hi. So I have a question for Mr. Ben. You mentioned that the competitive focus of South Africa is misdirected or misguided. So I wanted to ask, what do you think South Africa's immediate competitive focus should be?
If you listen to South Africa is actually a country of high sophistication and underdevelopment. And the areas where we excel, if you look at the motor vehicle manufacturers that run plants in South Africa, they're highly sophisticated. They're often within those global companies win awards as some of the best performing plants globally within their network. South Africa's got the skills to do that. South Africa's got the skills in pharma, whatever you look, there's a high level of sophistication that's available here. We don't celebrate that. We don't make it easy for people to bring in capital. For all of those motor companies, Buzi is right. They compete with so many other plants across the world. And for people that live here and work in those companies, they have a long association with the country. They want to be here, but we make it very, very difficult for them. And so I think if you have a proper coordinated event, tourism is something that we should be doing. I took a group of people on a safari recently. I was the only South African in the two camps that we were. The rest were all American or German. You know, so tourism is something that can bring in so much money, create so many jobs. Our telecom, mobile and tech industry is really, really advanced. And so we have to focus on that, and those things are really very, very good. There's a very interesting book written about the old industries in Japan. Japan actually is a very good example. It had all the companies like Sony, Matsushita, all of those companies that were very, very competitive and they built global companies because they competed globally. They set the global level of competition. Then you have a lot of companies that didn't have much competition, like security companies and so forth in the country. They were terrible. So for us, we need to understand what's going to be local and where can we work from here for the world. And if we can do that right, that's what China does. China lifted 1 billion people out of poverty doing exactly that, focusing on a plan not very human rights friendly in many, many ways, not really democratic, but what they did is they lifted a lot of people out of poverty. They created a new infrastructure. And we don't need to do it like that, but we should be doing that. India is currently doing it. They're moving very, very fast in the services industry. They're going back into other things. So for us, for many years, we had no investment needs in infrastructure, which was something that didn't attract a lot of capital. We now have massive needs for infrastructure. We need to create an environment where people would come in and invest in that. And so we've got capital. The other point that Vizi make, if you listen to the Middle East, first of all, they had a lot of oil money, but they know the oil money is running out. And so now they're focusing on the velocity of their capital. How can they turn that capital around as quickly as possible? And that's what you're seeing. They're turning this capital around. They're creating a place where people come and work and live. And you know, would you live in Cape Town or in Dubai? You know, it should be a slam dunk. But we're not creating that environment. And so we invest in the wrong things. We're not putting the focus on where we ought to develop.
Yeah. Can we have over here?
Okay, thank you. And morning. My question is probably maybe to the whole panel. I see we're talking business. What can the consumer do? Is the consumer well informed? Of course, as people participating in business, we might not, but where are South Africans spending their money? And how much of that money is actually retained in our economy? And again, is this cyclical? Will it come back again? And when it does, when we're on the up, what should we have in our hand? And I think my last one is talent versus business. How much are we retaining? Because a lot of institutions seem to be more committed to the administrative part of things because we're managing assets. But in terms of the talent itself or the capability, I'm talking engineers, as was mentioned there, what can we do in the meantime? And how big is the time frame in that space so that when opportunities come, the technology that we're consuming internationally, how can we localize it and how can we get the people, especially, for instance, education. I don't think schools are more effective at educating people, but technology could probably take that space. What can we do? What can the consumer do? Should I continue buying Bitcoin, or should I invest in a tuck shop in my neighborhood? Thanks.
Thank you for that. Vusi, do you want to take the one around talent and how we maximize that last question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What should the consumer do is above my pay grade, so I'll give it.
Namanga.
Vusi will know better. From a talent perspective, I think it's a, and I think Ben has just partly spoken to it. You know, I think it relates to the question of what should our competitive focus be. I think it's first a function of trying to define where we want to play as a country, what we want to be best known for, but also understanding where the entire global market is going. What is coming around the corner? You know, we, for instance, talking about careers that are not going to exist in the next 5-10 years, you know, and we need to therefore have a conversation around how do we actually get onto that bandwagon, and what does alignment, you know, in terms of positioning South Africa to win, you know, in the next 5 to 10 years look like. We have chosen to play in global stages. We're an open economy. We're not only competing with ourselves. I think Vusi put that beautifully. You know, this thing called the internet means that you're sitting here competing with someone in China. So it's a function of, you know, as basic as looking at the curriculum that we actually give to our kids at schools. You know, if you're going to be sitting with grade 4 learners who can't read for meaning, and grade 4 learners in Asia being taught programming and coding, you clearly see that these kids that we have in this country have lost the race before they've even begun running, because we're not positioning them for success. So I really think that it's a more complex, I think, conversation, and I think it's really a conversation of alignment, but also, you know, being very clear about choosing where we want to play, you know, because we're not going to be everything to everyone. So what are we best placed, and what are we best positioned to offer the world, and how do we make sure that we therefore put everything that we have from a resources perspective? I think that is how Singapore became what they are. They were very clear, you know, what they have at their disposal, how they actually make that work, so that they can be the wonder of the world that they are.
Yeah, Vusi?
There's a consistent theme that keeps coming up, which is this idea, and those of us who are P&L drivers will know this, that when you want to be effective, you can't worry about being popular.
Yeah.
It's almost this consistent theme. It's like underlying in this conversation, right? It's perhaps South Africa needs an unpopular leader.
Absolutely.
Perhaps we all need a leader that we all hate equally.
Yep.
Because then that person is going to be stern and driven by doing what is right and what is best. Literature also tells us, you know, you don't need an angel. We just need a person who's going to be effective. So, you know, to your comment around what can the consumer do, I don't know.
It's difficult.
It's difficult.
Neither do I, honestly.
In particular, especially because consumers are price takers. Now, we've had the good people at Proudly South African for years now, doing work around trying to conscientize all of us to buy South African product. It's 9:26. I don't know how many of you here today have thought about what it is you've done or consumed that's been South African. And I don't know by the end of the day if that thought will enter your mind. And so I think that a proudly South African consumer can't exist without a proudly South African citizen. That perhaps is the national project. How do we remind ourselves of who we are? We beat ourselves up so much we've forgotten who we are. I'm an 85 baby, so I'm young enough to be digital, old enough to be analog. I remember when I was growing up, the way you block somebody on your phone, was you remove the handset. Right? I'm old enough, Clement, you would remember those phones where you stuck your finger in the dial and you twisted it to find the number. And if you went and overshot it, you had to start again. I remember moving from a township school to a Model C school. I remember the first time I sit next to a white person in class. I remember the first time I dated a white girl. Thank you, Nelson Mandela. And I mention these things in jest because in some quarters, I and you are the pariah. There's something wrong with us for having been products of this new South Africa. And the question we must ask is, what was the purpose of fighting for a freedom if the fruits of that freedom are the forbidden fruit? And so the fruits of this freedom look and go, why must I stay here and be belabored? And I could just go somewhere else and my talent and skills are going to be appreciated. And so off the fruits go. We need to remind ourselves, 1996, Mark Williams scores those 2 goals against Egypt. And if you remember, there was a fellow with a potbelly who stood right behind the goalposts as Mark Williams scored, and he had a massive little thing written on his stomach that said Madiba Magic.
Wow.
We used to believe in ourselves. We've been beating ourselves so much that we have forgotten who we are. So a proudly South African consumer exists in the context of a proudly South African citizen. We need to learn the difference between being honest and critiquing and being negative and pessimistic. And typically those two, and you see Usisibusi does it very well, is data. When you're able to bring data into criticism, right? And devoid of all of those, almost everything else we're doing to me feels like it's like a slapstick solution. You know, a good mayor here, a decent councillor there, one decent CEO of a parastatal there. These are all slapstick solutions. Last comment, when I Clement, Sisbos, I don't understand this, and I don't have the privilege of occupying the corridors of power that you do, so you need to help me. How is it possible that a private citizen who takes it upon himself to get into the public enterprise, serve his country, has to run away from his country for fear of his life?
Yeah.
And none of us are outraged. The fellow who blew the whistle on the consulting firm, Ethel Williams, I think his name might be, is still not in South Africa. None of us are outraged. For me, these are the fundamentals where we must hold the line. I don't have to like you or agree with your politics, but I have to protect the idea that you are safe here. Because if you're not, then I'm not. Over the past week, I traveled to a different part of the country, and I don't want to cause trouble and say which, and my security team did a risk assessment and said, you need security. In my country. This can't be acceptable, surely. Yeah. So I'm saying this only to say, hey, guning but.
Yeah, guning, siyagowisha.
Siyagowisha, yeah, no, ziyakhala.
And it's even in academia. I mean, imagine a vice chancellor who needs bodyguard. Get Fort hair. You know, people are dying around him because he's doing the right thing, tackling corruption. And you become, there's money on your head. Okay, I'm going to take 2 more questions. You at the back, gentlemen, and then sisters here, and then I'll come back to you. I saw you and the other hands here. So yes, you, sir. And then can we just take those 2, concurrently, and then we'll go back online.
So I just wanted to speak about...
Please speak closer to the mic, sir. Thank you.
Sure. I wanted to check how the team looks at the correlation between corruption and lack of leadership in South Africa in terms of what we see as endemic and systemic in terms of the fall and the backwardness that we are going through now. In that, for all the statements that you've made, if you look at, for example, the education that you started with when you were speaking, and you look at the capital that was spoken of, for example, in each of the provinces there may be an institution that can fund entrepreneurship and fund business and help, but the corruption is so endemic as we see it that in each of those institutions, even a big institution in Sandton that belongs to government, for example, and others that are in the provinces, you will not just get the money, no matter how meritocratic your project or business may be. With all the things, whether you are able to do a business plan or not, the chances are, if you are intent on your project, you will do a lot to try and get it to work and get it to be approved if you are to, especially with the state of where South Africa is. I mean, not a lot of people will have money. The ones that start the business, they will definitely help. Otherwise, especially when you want to do something of significance. I'm an engineer in the oil and gas by profession. And we're doing something with one of the biggest mining company in the world. But the experience and the question I'm posing is, how are we going to change? How are we going to change, even if you change the ANC next year, for example? How is it likely to happen, firstly, and how is the impact likely to change the system that we are adopting in terms of poor education, corrupt system, corrupt South Africa as it is now? And you look at the leadership, the people that we're talking about, for example, yes, we would like to see a person that we may not necessarily like the gentleman was saying, but how are the chances that that's likely to happen with the system, with the democratic system we have, for example? Mm-hmm. And if you look at the impact in the long run as well, you look at the poor education means we have a number of, and I want to use the race as well, we have a number of black people that are likely to be less educated into the future for such a long time, that with the corruption on the finance side, no matter the number of entrepreneurs you have, if you have between 20 and 30% in some of the programs that a government is driving, success rate, for example, as a result of the corruption, government destroying the very employment that we are struggling with, for example. So my question is, I would like, I liked a lot of what we're discussing, and I liked some of the comments. One comment was, we speak a lot, what are we going to do? How are the chances it's going to, how are the chances it's going to change? Yeah. What can we do perhaps to inform a lot of us ordinary people to really make this change and support this change? Because South Africa is so backwards. All the business that is going out of South Africa is highly unlikely to come back anytime soon. Excuse me. And it impacts a whole lot of things. It impacts the entrepreneur that wants to start, whether by intention or circumstance. Yeah. We just have really we have a systemically poor working environment.
Yeah, got you.
For the business, for a number of things.
Thank you for that. Let's take another question, and then Yebo says, yeah.
Okay, so my question is for all of the panelists, and it's off something Sisbusi said, where she said we just need to put the right people in power. So next year is 2024, and it's less than a year now till I'm expected to wake up in the morning and to go vote. And I'd like to hear from your views. Who would you think
Halala.
would be somebody that I could perhaps put my on to somewhat turn the ship around?
Yeah, because often people say, yeah, you're telling people that they need to exercise their vote and change. Then they're like, but what's viable? What are the viable options? And actually the two questions are correlated. When the gentleman is asking about what needs to be done, and because even if you change a political party, for instance, I'm thinking about the Electoral Act right now that was passed by Parliament. Terrible, because it puts power in the hands of the politicians, not in you as a constituency.
Sure.
So whether you've got the ANC or you've got Action SA, you've got EFF, whatever party that's in power, you and I, as the constituencies, don't have power over them. We don't have power to hold them accountable when they are in Parliament. And these are political parties who voted for this Electoral Act. They don't care about you as a constituency. They care about the power that they wield in that institution of government. So the two questions, which I think are related, who wants to start? What do we do? And are there viable options?
So maybe from a corruption and leadership perspective and the correlation between those two, the short answer is that there is none. Corruption and leadership can't exist in the same sentence. It's just unheard of. So what do we do? How do we change it? Honestly, I think from where I'm sitting, you still put the right people in power who can actually deal with the systemic and endemic corruption, because it's not going to go away on its own. When you do have corruption in certain government units, departments, I mean, when we have it in corporate South Africa, you chuck the people out, you deal with them. Yeah. So the problem is that it is so systemic and endemic, and it continues to fester because we haven't dealt with it. But you see, the problem is that we can't deal with it. We can't deal with it as this government because this fish called South Africa is rotten from the head. If Cyril is sitting with the Phala scandal, he's got no, where does he even begin dealing with corruption? When you're sitting with the ANC top 6, with the Nomvula Mokonyana, who sold this country for chicken pieces and a Louis Vuitton bag, what do you think is going to happen in the rest of government? So you therefore have to understand that the tolerance level for corruption in this country is very high. You have ministers and government elected officials who have been implicated in corruption scandals. They feature in all the 6 parts of the Zondo report. Yeah. And they're still walking around as ministers. That's the problem. You've got government ministers and elected officials who see nothing wrong about stealing food parcels from the hungry and PPE from the sick and dying. You've got thieves masquerading as government ministers. That's the problem. That is where you change it. Yeah. So you therefore... the message that we have given to the country, and we are surprised why corruption and crime is so rife in the country. It's because we have said to South African citizens, crime pays. And I think you don't have to work hard, you don't have to do all these things that we're taught, to do. Growing up as young kids, work hard, get a better education, whatever it is, the values that you and I grow up with, those have been pushed aside. We have told the South African citizens explicitly and implicitly that crime pays. So that is the environment that we're currently living in. How you change it, you get the right people in power who can deal with the corruption. The ones that we have at the moment, and I think Vusi has just actually said it, you try and whistleblow, you try and do something to root out the corruption, the next thing a few months later, you actually have to leave the country and go and seek refuge, somewhere else, because then they are going to, where is Babita today?
Sure.
The lady who tried to deal with, right, where, that is the message. And who is in jail for her killing?
She's exposed so much, and no one today has been held accountable, even in her death. Because News 24 has done an amazing job at reporting about the emails that she had sent before she died that exposed massive corruption. No one has been held accountable, so she died in vain, and that's really the truth. Vusi, she asked a direct question. She has to wake up next year and go vote. You saying, let's do things differently. What are the available options for her? Because South Africans, what I find is they get so desperate that they say, and I'm sure you've heard this, Vusi, where they say, why don't you run for president?
Yeah.
Have you not heard that before?
I would be drunk. I mean, so I think that is perhaps the single most important responsibility of every citizen, is to think about to whom it is do they surrender their rights of citizenry. And far be it for me to ever suppose for you who you vote for. What are the fundamentals? First, I love hearing in political discourse when the incumbent says, we will self-correct. As a student of strategy, there is not a single time in history when an incumbent has self-corrected. Not in business, and certainly not in politics. Incumbents don't self-correct. If they did, Nokia would still be around. Kodak would still be around.
Yeah.
Incumbents don't self-correct. The National Party would still be around.
Yeah.
Right? Incumbents require disruption from smaller players. It's the only language they understand. So I say that to you only to say the following. I'm personally excited to see what happens in the next iteration of our national election cycle. I'm excited to see an ANC below 50% insofar as how it governs itself. I'm excited to see what happens at Luthuli House when they're below 50%. I'm interested to see, you know, in a large corporate, when I was in corporate, one of the things I used to notice is people can hide in the cupboards. Find someone that works in a department for 26 years and no one knows what they do. That doesn't happen in small businesses, right? In small businesses, the CEO will make you tea if he finds you at reception. And so what I'm excited to see is this long tail of mushrooming parties claw market share, become bigger challengers, and challenge the thinking of the incumbent. To begin to finally put enough strain on this idea of this collective tripartite governance system and ask of it the question, can you be ideologically honest and house both capitalists, socialists, and communists in the same party? And how do you propose to, from your same ranks, have a minister of public enterprises who belongs to the communist cluster but has effectively privatized public enterprises? Because he understands there's a difference between ideology and reality. And at the same time, a ministry in Treasury and Finance that is seized with how do we push forward the South African economy, and yet a Reserve Bank saying we need to be careful and watch inflation. So even in just the governance system, these fault lines are there, but they can hide when we are in the majority. Once that majority fades, they can't hide anymore. Right? So I don't know who. I can tell you, quick little one, what I did last time. True story. I was traveling, and I think I was in Pietermaritzburg or Piet Retief, and there was, I'm driving through this, like, you know, these small towns, and there's a total garage, and I go in and I get my car filled up, and there's a Nissan NP200 Bakkie, and there's a guy coming past with a placard that said, "Vote Nadeko." I don't know Nadeko. I voted for them. Right? And I'm saying this in jest, it's true, simply to say there's a correlation citizens must understand between, I don't buy it, Clement, when people say there are no options.
Absolutely.
There are choices. You might not like your options, but you have a choice.
Lovely.
Right? And so you might not, so you have to, at the end of the day, buy bread. You might not like white bread or rye or but you've got to buy it.
Yeah.
So go and buy the bread that you think for the interim is going to give you sustenance.
Yeah. Okay. I want to take this question online for you, Ben, and then take two more. Let's try keep the questions short and some responses because we've got about 10 minutes left. Someone online is asking, Ben, should government incentivize international cooperation with tax breaks to lure them into the country?
I wouldn't do that as a blanket authority. I think there are two sides to that. I mean, some really responsible international corporations have stimulated a lot of other investment and development around what they do. The motor manufacturers, the just-in-time manufacturers, I think are really good examples of that. There are certain cases if the government has got a very holistic, cohesive plan of what they want to achieve, there might be certain circumstances where they want to do that. But I think what is even more important is the leadership. You know, we have a lot of foreign people coming into the country, but for foreign people that are highly educated or highly specialized or sophisticated, it's very difficult to get them in the country. And so I think these two things go hand in hand. We need great leadership. We need companies that can make a difference. And in certain cases, government should. You know, if you look at the Cecil case study in America, when they landed there, they had a whole entourage waiting for them, saying to them, "We want you to invest. We want you to do it here. We'll give you this. We'll help you with that." I don't think we actually that well geared up to do some of this. But again, if you do it in a blanket way, then you also create a problem. So I think it has to be directed by a very cohesive and smart driver leading that.
All right, can I take you, ma'am? And then you, yes, and then I'll come back. Yes, that's you. There.
Thank you. Hi, my question is directed to the floor in general. You aptly spoke about labor law reform, accountability, corruption. To what extent would you say the economy is struggling or stifled because of inaction of the legal sphere, whether it be due to lack of enforcing accountability or lack in legislation, perhaps for protection for SMEs or any other measures?
Okay, great. Another one?
Hi, I think my question is around, it's for the whole panel, and it's around maybe how do we encourage entrepreneurs to get into more innovative sectors, for example, tech, and move away from the survivalist perspective, and maybe how do we also cultivate an environment where that allows businesses to thrive here.
Yeah, great. Can I please take another one? Yes. Yes, you see, sir. Yes, you, sir.
Thank you. I think to summarize, we lack leaders with integrity. I think that's one characteristic that we need to is integrity. And we've realized that we talk about South Africans being resilient, but I think we've managed to champion all the crises that we've survived, not because of government, but despite of government. So to latch on to the gentleman's question, what do we as consumers do? Vusi spoke about proudly South African citizens. Vusi, from a leadership and business point of view, do I take the last pennies that I have left and invest it in a civic organization where it's a case of I'm my brother's keeper, or do I keep on spending my money on services that government is supposed to deliver, and which is obviously a waste of money? Or do I start on my block where I live in my street, where I'm my brother's keeper and we fix things for ourselves and invest our money, the last pennies that we have left, in fixing our lives for ourselves? And from a business point of view, Vusi as well, employers, organizations, do we invest our money there, or do we just keep on throwing money into this dark, deep pit?
Yeah, this is related to the question we also have online. Someone who says government alone may not be able to resolve all of these challenges of poverty and unemployment. How best can the private sector assist in addressing the challenges? Vusi, do you mind taking the one around tech and innovation and how entrepreneurs?
Thank you so much. Thank you. I actually was going to ask of you to do that. So I should have disclosed, so I'm the chair of Silicon Cape. We are the oldest silicons of the silicons in the continent. And so I get to see almost all of the innovation startups coming up across the country. Two major themes I want you to think about and perhaps worry over this evening. First, South Africa is now reproducing and manufacturing an artificial inequality actively. We're doing this in part with the miseducation of the predominantly black African children going to public schools who, as Usisibusi said, are not ready for the world as it is. So I see these incredible innovation-led startups, tech startups, are predominantly white, male started, or foreign African. In 20 years' time, dare I say 10 years' time, when some of those startups have been built, wealth has been created, and those founders have exited those businesses, you're going to have a huge amount of inequality just with the amount of resources created out of that.
Yeah.
That goes to this. Who are we holding accountable for the mess that is the education system? Because there was a time it was not so.
Yeah.
Now, I remember the period of Professor Kara Asmal was when they started making some of these changes. Then they experimented, frankly, with things that just didn't need an experimentation. And as a consequence, we are where we are. So I say this to you, my sister, which is this artificial manufactured inequality, for me, is the real ticking time bomb. Because in 10 years' time, you're going to have a group of young people who have no equity in the South African system or economy. No equity. And they're going to see these patterns of wealth, ownership, income distribution perpetuated again. And into the fire is going to step the feverishly high politicians who will use that and say, see, we told you. The economy is not transforming again. They won't say we messed up. They'll say it is not transforming. So the work I'm very seized with at Silicon Cape is how do we take what we've learned over 20 years and democratize it? So if there's a Silicon Kuruman, say to them, don't spend 20 years trying to figure out how to build tech startups in Kuruman. We'll show you. We'll teach you. We'll give you the template. How do we democratize that? There should be a Silicon Kuruman, a Silicon Kwakwa, a Silicon Hamanskral. What do you guys need to do to build an environment where if there are those who are that way inclined, they are able to access those resources? If we don't, this little device that is now the collective gravitational suck of global commerce will only funnel wealth to a particular demographic. And we will turn around again and blame the result without understanding what led to it.
Yeah, and as we see the question around what's stifling the economy, is it no legislation in place, lack of support for businesses? And I know on the radio I would normally say you have 20 seconds.
What's stifling the economy? I think it's really everything that we've already spoken about, that the economy is not growing because the trading environment is not what it should be. But I think when you actually take it, it's really economics 101. You need to have, and honestly, it all starts with leadership. You need to have the right leadership who is going to put good policies in place. Good policies in place are going to increase business confidence. Business confidence is going to spur investment. Investment is going to make sure that the economy grows at the right levels. And if the economy is growing at the right levels, then you start arresting unemployment. And if unemployment is addressed, then equality and poverty are therefore addressed. So I think it really starts, that is what's stifling the economy. We don't have investment. Why don't we have the investment? We don't have the right trading environment. Why don't we have the right trading environment? You know, you don't have, there's delivery failure. Why do you have delivery failure? You don't have the right people in power. Why don't you have the right people in failure? It really is the entire thing that we've been talking about.
Ben, the last question was...
And then one point I would add to that is very often our policies and so forth are designed to deal with the symptom of poverty and unemployment, where that is an outcome of many different policies that actually make that a permanent embedment. You know, if you deal with the right order of what you want to do, then that will be a positive outcome. But creating a policy around that, focusing on a symptom, is exactly the wrong thing to do. It perpetuates.
The question from online was, the government can't do this on their own. What can the private sector do?
I think the initiative that Buzi is leading is really very important. It starts with government and larger corporations. And if you can get that right, that facilitates the next level of companies. The private sector should be creating jobs. The government should have policies that create an environment where people bring capital and create the opportunity to do this in a seamless way. And if you focus on that, have a small government with a very big private sector focused on delivering the right outcome, I think it's not that difficult. But currently, the wheel is turned the other way around.
Okay. I'm going to ask my guests, there are two questions I didn't take from this side, but I can't take them now because we're completely out of time, so I apologize. So if someone comes and asks a question, it must be from this gentleman. And I think there's another, you've already asked someone up there. Please, if you can engage them for the question that they have. But thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the audience that's here. People that are watching us as well from the various places. Please remember to check out your UP social media and your email inboxes for updates on when we're going to have this next UP Alumni Business Breakfast, when it's going to take place. And thank you to, of course, the University of Pretoria, the Alumni Relations team for organizing this. And please give it up for the panelists, Vusi, Ben, and this is Marissa. right, thank you very much, everyone, for watching, and we'll go have breakfast afterwards. Thank you.